And welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Coming up on the first presidential debate on Wednesday, and I'm just kind of curious, even what you think about it. We'll open up the phones here in just a few minutes, what you think about the debate. Are you going to watch it? Why or why not? What do you hope to hear from Mitt Romney or from Barack Obama, either one, going into this debate, the first one on Wednesday night? Now, there's a pretty dismal thing going on. We have talked about this before. And we played the soundbite. Remember, we played the soundbite of Barack Obama from 1998. Let's see, is this where I wanted to go in this segment? Did I want to go somewhere else in this segment before I jumped in? Oh, yeah. Scratch that. Let's stay on track here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the comments I made at the Religious Liberty Rally. Then I want to get into the campaign. So I'll just take a couple minutes on this. What I talked about at this Religious Freedom Rally yesterday, it's a tendency to get a little bit dispirited at this time, and you look at what's going on with the polls, and you wonder how significant they are that show kind of Romney falling behind and Obama surging. You look at sort of a lackluster Romney campaign. It's hard to get kind of excited about what's coming out of that campaign. Everybody kind of understands that and recognizes that. I had that story last week. Now, there is nobody in the Republican Party that wants to take credit for the fact that Mitt Romney is the nominee of the Republican Party. I mean, not even the ruling class Republicans want to accept ownership for the fact that he is the nominee. The Tea Party, of course, they don't. And so it's interesting. He's sort of an orphan right now politically. So anyway, you can get a little bit dispirited. But the point that I made, I told a story from Salem, Massachusetts back in February of 1776 or 1775. This is before Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. This is before Lexington, before Concord. This is even before the issuing of the Declaration of Independence, February 25, 1775. Now, what happened, the British had gotten wind of the fact that the colonists in Salem were converting retired cannons from ships into field weapons at this forge in Salem. So they sent 250 of the Royal Welch Fusiliers to take possession of these cannons. Now, Paul Revere discovered what was going on. He sent a writer out there to alert the people in Salem, so the entire community knew what was coming when these Royal Fusiliers marched into town, and they had time to hide the cannons in the woods, and they just piled leaves on top of them. And so they were hidden. They were away from the forge where nobody could find them, and they were concealed in the forest. So anyway, the British soldiers come, and they march into town, and some of the men from Salem pulled up the planks on one of the footbridges they had to cross to get to Salem, and so that slowed them down. They had to rebuild that bridge, and then they tromp across the bridge, and by the time they get to Salem, and they were under instructions from Gage to strike on Sunday morning when he knew everybody would be in church. I mean, that's something interesting right there. That tells you something about what even the British understood about the religious nature of the American people in 1775. He gave them orders. You strike them on Sunday morning because they will all be in church and we can catch them by surprise. But they didn't because of Paul Revere and his band of merry writers, committees of correspondence and all that. So the people get the word that the British regulars are on the way in, so they pour out of their meeting houses into the street. So by the time the soldiers get to the middle of town, I mean, there is a throng of people, and militia in the neighboring areas had been alerted, and they were starting to come into Salem. Now, the residents of Salem, the men of Salem, they're the only way you could get to the forge where these cannons were supposed to be was to cross this drawbridge. So the guys in Salem, they pulled up the drawbridge. So there's no way for Leslie to get Colonel Alexander Leslie to get his troops across the North River to look for the cannons. And they're surrounded now by hostile Americans. And he commands these men to lower the drawbridge. They just laugh at him, start calling his troops name, making fun of them. They're sitting up on the drawbridge, dangling their legs over the edge of the drawbridge and taunting the British soldiers. And so Leslie sees, look, there's these 3 fishing boats down tied up to the bank. He orders his men to commandeer those vessels, and the colonials see what the intentions are, so they jump into these boats before the British soldiers can get there, and they start knocking holes in the bottom of the boat to sink them, and they sunk all 3 of them. And one of them was a foreman of a local distillery. And he's in there punching a hole in the bottom of the boat. One of the British soldiers comes up to him, points a bayonet at him, tells him to stop. And instead of stopping this Jacob Joseph Witcher, the distillery foreman, he just rips open his shirt and bares his chest to the British soldier, looks him straight in the eye, basically dares him to run him through with the bayonet, and the British soldier actually pokes him with the bayonet and draws blood. That was the first blood that was drawn in the American Revolution. Cooler heads prevailed. He retreats. Now they got no way to get across, and things are getting pretty tense. About that time, a clergyman walks up by the name of Thomas Barnard. He says, "I am Thomas Barnard, a minister of the gospel. My mission is peace." And so he talks to Leslie, and now Barnard knows that the cannons are gone. He knows the cannons are off to safety. Nobody will ever find them. So he says to Leslie, "Look, I'll make a deal with you. It's getting kind of tense here. And if you will promise me as an officer and a gentleman that if you go across the drawbridge and you look in the forge and you don't find any cannon that you will leave, I'll convince them to lower the drawbridge." He said, "Okay." So Barnard, this preacher, gets them to lower the drawbridge. Alexander Leslie takes his guys across the bridge. They scour the forge. Sure enough, no cannons. And he was an officer and a gentleman. He kept his word, and so they walk back across the drawbridge. And then they start marching out of town like he'd promised to do. And there was a housewife by the name of Sarah Tarrant, young woman in her 20s. She leans out the window, and she starts hollering at these British troops, "Go home and tell your master he has sent you on a fool's errand." And one of the soldiers is so ticked off at her impertinence that he takes his gun off of his shoulder and points it right at her head. And instead of retreating inside the window, she sticks her head out even further and says, "Go ahead and fire if you have the courage, but I doubt it." I mean, she just called him out. You got the courage to do it. You got the boldness to do it. Go ahead and shoot. And sure enough, the guy didn't. And they left town, and all of the militia and the residents of Salem were kind of goose-stepping and mock cadence as these British troops were marching single file out of town. And the point that I made in my comments is that, look, this was the first instance where ordinary Americans just stood up to tyranny. These were ordinary Americans. In fact, you could maybe even trace the origin of the drive for independence to that moment. And so, look, these were ordinary Americans. You had a guy that today would be driving a beer truck. You had a preacher of the gospel, and you had an ordinary housewife. And these were the ones that looked tyranny in the eye and refused to blink. And so that was my challenge to all of us there at the Religious Liberty Rally. Look, if ordinary Americans could establish our liberty, then ordinary Americans like you and me can reclaim our liberty. Now, I want to shift gears and talk about